fact.
So we do have one bit of business arising from in camera. We don't have to, Aaron doesn't have to come back in.
No, he doesn't.
No,
Make a motion?
I move that the mayor draft a letter of guarantee for MB Power.
You've got the format for this.
Oh, yeah, just the mayor signed the letter.
Yeah, okay.
Do we have a seconded by
Actually,
Councillor
probably get you
Now,
guys to
all
sign
in
it on the
favor?
way out here.
Carried.
I think Aaron wants to take it with him. So.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
We sold the wind farm, Aaron.
All right. So
Sold
we
it to
do have an
NSPI.
item. I closed the agenda there. I could bring it back up if needed, but there's only one item on it, which is housing discussion.
Yeah.
So if we're ready to move into that.
Okay, this particular item results from a discussion we had at a council meeting, the second council meeting in September. And Councillor Carver and Councillor O'Neill at that time had agreed to lead a discussion on what some of the housing issues were in the town of Mahone Bay, with an eye to, at some point, council probably undertaking to find ways to deal with those issues, notwithstanding the strategic plan statement that we find ways to stabilize the housing market in Mahone Bay. That's the current strategic plan, which of course comes up for renewal next month, I think. February, is it not, Mr. Hyde?
Yeah, so last year when we amended the plan, we would do an annual review of the strategic plan, and we'll do that before the budget, so February would be when we're.
So that would impact the operational plan at that time. Okay. Over to you.
Well, first
So-
off, I didn't understand, it wasn't my understanding that this particular meeting was to be led by Councillor O'Neill.
Nor
or
mine.
Councillor Carver. I think that idea had fallen by the wayside.
Oh, okay.
I guess I can say that like the actual motion to have this discussion came on our discussion on November 28th. And at that time, I had been asked to come back with a response to a question of should the town have a housing committee, and the previous question that had inspired that question of should the town have a specific housing strategy. And my response to both of those questions was to suggest that we should consider amending our strategic plan.
It's all done.
And in order to amend
We
our
sold
strategic plan, we should have a conversation around housing.
So if you just help, make me an offer first.
Okay.
So we should have a discussion around housing so that we could look at, when we get to that strategic plan review, is there an opportunity to put some specific expectations around what staff, if anything, should be doing around housing policy, specifically around the question of affordability versus affordable housing, influencing market development versus making land available or creating a structure like a land trust. So really to hear some feedback, and then hopefully this will help councillors to consider in the strategic plan, would somebody like to make a specific suggestion about actually saying we are going to try to create affordable housing, or we're going to influence market, or affordability is not the primary, because it doesn't come into it on the current strategic plan. And I just thought I'd bring up the current strategic plan, put it in the background, but this is really for councillors to discuss. And I could bring up any of the documents that I sent out, but they're just documents that you've received from other sources through the year.
And today's discussion is primarily focused on those documents that were sent out that deal with the different types of housing.
Well, they're
and
definitely
different
intended to
opportunities
provide
for housing.
background to council.
Okay.
So I know people have mentioned a few times over the year that I've been here about, what if we had an interest in. So I'd just love to hear from councillors, what is your interest in housing? Where do you think the town should be? Are there some questions that you need answered, especially between now and the strategic plan?
Okay.
We had a nice delegation from, is it the Municipal Housing Corporation? Is that the right entity? They had a new executive director.
A while back.
I think it was appointed, let's call it, 24 months ago, 18 months ago? They came and provided council some context on their plans, and it was really around Cherry Lane and the major capital investment that they were undertaking. And I think they spent several $100,000, didn't they, on major renovations to Cherry Lane. I think it's been completely
We
restored.
get the bill.
And yeah, that's right. That's right. We did the bill on the shortfall.
They don't ask you.
No, that's right. But I guess the question is that like our bill relative to is really just financing the operating deficit, right? Like, and then if there's a cap, we make a contribution towards the capital payment.
Yeah, we have a set percentage on the capital.
Yeah.
So, in the context of the capital plan going forward and our capital budget, we don't have any funding in place if we were able to strike an arrangement with that entity to do a third building. That's and nor do we have property that could be allocated towards that, maybe in lieu of the capital payment. But in my mind, that's always been a kind of a viable option that in lieu of cash, we would provide property if we had surplus property that would be appropriate for that kind of a facility. I don't know, what are we talking, 10 or 12 units? That is truly subsidized housing relative to the Bob Uden facility, which is quasi-subsidized funding.
But that is subsidized,
It is.
and he will never enter to that program again.
Right.
Because it's not feasible for a developer.
But
We made it
demographic,
very clear at our economic.
right.
Although that's Mr. Uden's opinion,
Absolutely.
based on his business acumen, that it may not be.
It can be subsidized if the underlying renter requires subsidy versus you can't get the apartment unless you are under certain criteria, which is like demographically the folks that are residing on Cherry Lane and the folks residing on Kinburn Street are, worlds apart. I think we'll all agree. Like, they really are worlds apart demographically. So I've often thought that housing option as a municipality dealing with the provincial government to have, I mean, how old are those buildings, Carl? They've got to be 45 years old. I mean,
Yeah, you
Are they
see.
really that old?
Hilda Burgoyne
Yeah.
sold them the land that it's
They got-
on,
they got-
right?
It used to be a field hockey field till they
Yeah.
built it.
So
Rich probably remember that.
it's been a long time
Play
since
about
we've had an
Yeah.
investment, a big, like a capital investment. So to expand, so a third facility that would expand would really help, I think.
So if I can just comment on that, I think the first question to housing would be, would they even have an interest in
Right.
building more?
Exactly.
My understanding, and I don't know if that was when Dan was here that they did the roadshow, Dan who's now the CIO of Chester.
Oh yeah, I didn't know
but
that.
I think
yeah.
that was when Dan
Yeah,
was
I
here.
think so.
But they're really pushing the market alternatives and the subsidies such as the Uden development. And
Sure they
I
are.
don't think they're looking to construct more publicly owned units, but that's a question we can certainly ask them directly. Yeah.
One of the attachments that we got in preparation for this talked about the changing role and responsibility of the federal government and the provincial government in that whole housing niche. And it does seem to some degree to be shifted down to the municipal level with suggestions other than we'll build it for dealing with the issue. My question when I was reading through the material was, what is the level of housing that we should have in Mahone Bay? I mean, look at Bob Uden's building, where I think about a third of the apartments are rent assisted.
Subsidy, yeah.
How many of the people who are living in those apartments lived in Mahone Bay prior to the apartments being available? It's like if you build it, they will come. If you built a 25 unit building in Mahone Bay or a 30 unit building, you could probably accommodate most of the people with inadequate housing who are living in the town, but they're not the ones that are going to get the accommodation. So it's almost like a never ending cycle trying to find accommodation for people. Councillor O'Neill?
I agree, and I think that the housing issue has a whole bunch of different planks to it, and developing is absolutely one. But really starting with the value statement and what the objective is, and who it is that you are like intending to serve. So I think when I think about housing in Mahone Bay, I see it as a very complex and interconnected issue. And one of the things that I keep coming back to is this this current trend to that's destabilizing the existing housing stock in favor of short-term rentals, and that's intersecting with a move toward downsizing and one-floor living and having energy-efficient housing and having housing that young families who are workers who are working in our great businesses can actually afford. And then also, we have residents who are, who could use additional income. So there's a lot of variables. And so when I sort of put these together, I sometimes think, and also on our strategic plan, we have an intention. I don't know the exact timing to look into tiny houses, or what is now sort of morphing into. I think it's listed as tiny homes on the plan. But it's morphing into right-sized homes or smaller homes, and we've seen a couple of really lovely examples of those being built in town, just off Main Street, for example. I believe not tiny homes, but sort of smaller, modest homes in town.
Okay.
The person near you who subdivided their property, for example.
Oh, Rod White's
Yeah,
house.
and I guess when I thought about it, and then that again, and I'm sorry if this is becoming amorphous, but in my mind it is rather amorphous but very connected. But I also think about some of the meetings we've had about resiliency and community and knowing who your neighbors are and neighborhood and these kinds of things. And so I wonder, where we can, if we can start to think about, what type of neighborhoods do we want to build in Mahone Bay, and would close-knit neighborhoods be assisted by people having secondary buildings, secondary structures on their property, much like the initiative Halifax is undertaking, to have grandparent suites and secondary dwellings on their properties. And that would, have an obvious impact to personal property values and thus the tax base.
Okay.
So I have been wondering, like, it would to sort of shake things up a bit and just make it easier and actually encourage people to understand how they can put secondary dwellings on their property that would serve as reasonably priced housing for people, not temporary rentals,
Okay.
but would also bring in some income to some of the people that would need it, and also address things like loneliness and community.
Okay. Councillor Bain, you had a.
Well, I was just gonna qualify one of the statements that I made about the Kinburn. Yes, Mr. Uden said he wouldn't do that again.
The apartments.
Unless the rules changed, because it was not in favor of the developer. I think some of my concern about some of these other smaller properties, like Councillor O'Neill has talked about, is how you lock it in. A lot of the tiny homes are for sale. If you go on, look it up, if you Google it, they have not worked.
That's right.
They're too small.
Yeah.
And by
The
definition,
real.
they're too small. They're
Yeah,
being morphed
tiny.
into Airbnb rentals in many, many cases. And so I think, there has to be some pretty hard decisions taking a look at what you can do and what you can't do. And are you against Airbnb? Are you for it? Or how do you retain some of these smaller units as long-term rentals when maybe they're going to sit vacant for whatever reason? I mean, grandparents do pass away. In that, in principle, I think it's fine. I think it's just a very, very large subject. I think Bridgewater is really doing quite a good job, because they're obviously affording their transportation, which goes in hand with some of those large apartment developments that they have, and there's room in Bridgewater that they're going to continue to do it. My understanding is they're looking at another 1,500 units.
Okay.
Wow.
CAO.
Yeah, all I was going to say is just in terms of I think there's a very interesting, because all of this discussion lately has been about regulation of development, so planning strategy, land use bylaw stuff, which is one of the ways in which a municipality can interact with housing. and to talk about the idea that, you know, you want to allow for smaller units or make certain flexibility there to encourage more infill of those smaller units, certainly appropriate for an older population, but also restrict the ability of those units to end up as short-term rental. And, you know, really to me that speaks to talking about residential zone housing requirements and saying in a residential zone, maybe you can allow for smaller units, maybe less lot coverage, less setbacks, things that would encourage that type of infill of granny units, secondary suites, a subdivision to create two small homes. But you can also prohibit short-term rental in those zones, and you could be very specific that, you know, short-term rental doesn't belong in the same zone that you're talking about for this type of development. So just to kind of emphasize that it is within our power to do within the planning strategy. and land use
Okay,
bylaw.
Deputy Mayor?
Yeah, I think some study could be done on this, but I don't think it's something for staff to spend a ton of time on. I mean, we could look at subdividing a lot if it's big enough, like Rod White did as your example. That was a big lot.
Huge.
But I mean, we don't have land to say, let's bring a developer in and build low affordable housing. You know, I sat the other night trying to think, where would we have land? And the only one I don't even know we can get would be the Renouf property. And half of that is in the municipality. And I don't know where that sits now as he's passed on, but we don't have land.
One of the suggestions that was made in some of the documentation was residential properties on brownfield sites.
Well, I can't see how that's gonna fly.
Honestly, you know,
We
that
don't
was
want-
one of the
Oh,
alternatives
I know.
that was suggested to reduce the cost of providing the housing. So then you get on the other side of Faubourg Road.
Yeah.
Right? Or the other side of the trail, where the Habitat for Humanity we provided for
Yeah.
2 building lots up there.
Well, I think that also brings up a point you've made before, which is that opening roads is something that we can do to allow properties that currently
Yep.
don't seem to be available for development to become available for development. So we should keep in mind that opening roads is something that we can do.
And if we had a bylaw that says you will take town sewer, you will take town water.
Yeah.
It serves to reinforce the
Has our
utilities.
Mr. Chair, has our subdivision bylaw changed so that the developer does not make that decision as to using town water? I thought there had been some change since Hawthorne Hill was built,
I don't know, maybe CAO or
where
have one of his
where
staff.
he was able to make his own decision, and he made a decision on sewer, but not on water.
And that was his proposal, and
Yeah.
council agreed with his
Agreed with it.
proposal.
That's a long
Yeah.
time ago now.
I don't think the developer should have that choice.
Well, either
No.
do I, but my understanding was that he was able to make that
Yep.
decision. Now, maybe
That's
you're
right.
absolutely
That was-
right.
He came to council with his proposal and said, I don't have the money to do the water, but I will do sewer, so.
And the town didn't have the
We-
money to put the water up anyway.
You know
So it's a
how-
moot point, right?
You know how much money our utility
None.
makes.
But if we wanted to look at
That was
tracts
then.
of land
Yeah.
that could be opened up for housing development, that could be part of the town's and the province and CMHC's involvement would be to service the land and maximize the number of reasonable size residential building lots in the property.
It worked, and I think I'm right on Hawthorne Hill. As lots were started built on, then the developer got a kickback once they were hooked up to the town water, or town sewer. I assume
Yeah.
that would apply also.
Same
if
with
they were
power.
hooked up to town
Power,
water, because I mean, I don't know how many, let's say there's a dozen houses there and everybody has a $10,000 hole in
Yeah.
their water.
Yeah.
So, Mayor, it seems like, in my mind, that the hierarchy of needs is really around the most vulnerable citizens. One of whom we might have just talked about a little while ago.
For housing.
For housing. So, I mean, the rental market, as I understand it, would have just seen a $50 a month increase on average across the Mahone Bay market, January 1st. So you used to be paying $1,500 a month for two-bedroom, you're not paying $1,550. If you're paying $1,650, you're not paying $1,700. As of like kind of across the market
Okay.
in Mahone Bay, in our town. So like if you dimension that out and think 15, 16, 17, and Councilor Bain's kind of well apprised of those markets too. If you do the math on that, like what the relative annual income needs to be to support that kind of rental, relative to what, say, the Cherry Lane scenario, where you pay a percentage of your income and it gets subsidized. I mean, we're not at all talking with the same group of people demographically. That's a dramatically more affluent community that could afford an apartment at $1,500, $1,600, $1,700 a month. We're talking about not being able to afford to pay $1,500 a year in property tax. So you need to be in the $700, $800, $900 a month rental range to be able to meet some of our criteria around low income housing. So it would be nice to know definitively if the government would join us in an arrangement to expand the existing facilities. But we would need to do something. Like we would need to have something to contribute, either A, cash, or B, an in-kind contribution of property. And I think that's all we can do. Like that would be the extent of our ability to be part of the solution. We can only bring two things really to the table, well, beyond legislation. One, money, and two, land. So if we were going to go and have the conversation with the province about expanding their existing facility base, we would probably want to have something to offer them up front.
Now you're talking about a third iteration of
And we all know that even if we had that contribution, either cash or in kind, we still know we're talking about something that wouldn't happen for 36 months from now.
And does Cherry Lane accommodate families?
No.
That's-
Single living.
That's really, and I think that this is why for me it comes back to starting with the value statement and starting with understanding, what you're trying to accomplish through your housing strategy, right? So we can absolutely, if we opened up 1,000 units of very, very low income, I mean, this is, slippery slope, but very, very low income units, like we would fill them, and lovely people would move into them, and that may or may not be consistent with what we see for the town in terms of the strategy. So I'm sort of I'm looking at what the trends are in housing right now, and with so many people retiring and wanting to retire together, and choosing who they're retiring with. So they're not ready to go to homes, for example, but they're choosing sort of more purposeful community to retire with their friends and that kind of thing. And they want smaller homes and less hassle in their life. So, and that maps on really nicely with the trend toward not tiny homes, because I'm in complete agreement that seems to be trending out, but smaller sized homes, well-built, smaller sized homes.
Or co-op housing.
Or co-op housing. And then I look at the number of businesses that are starting up, and we've been talking about getting a nursing home in town, and how many jobs and that's going to bring into the area, and we're going to need people. People will want to live here because of those kinds of developments, and people will, we need workers that are not driving in from other places to be able to work here. And I think our housing strategy, starting with a vision, we'd be well served to start with, what is the vision that we want for the town, and build in from there. But and I think that, again, there's all kinds of different planks to address it, and building, a Cherry Lane style facility is definitely part of that landscape, but there's no one thing.
Councillor Carver, you've been notably quiet in our shack representative.
Yes.
and-
Yes, well, I'm thinking, Dylan, could you put up the bullets that are under encourage a range of housing options,
Yes.
just for reference? As Councillor O'Neill said earlier, it's such an amorphous, huge, complex situation. I think that we have to develop our vision and our strategy to really hone down on what we want. I don't think that there's any mileage in looking at a third facility such as Cherry Lane. I don't think that the department is simply not there. They're not going to build anymore. They are looking at portable subsidies
Gotcha.
and other ways of addressing it. Or portable subsidies are the kind of situation that Bob Uden has in his apartment building. So it's hard to know where to start. I mean, what I wrote down some questions. What kind of affordable housing is most important for Mahone Bay? So that's our strategy. What is it we're really after? Is it for seniors? Is it rental? Is it ownership? I mean, we've tried all of those. Or is it for to encourage young families to come in and rent? And we've all heard the stories about families and individuals, but often families, who've been ejected from perfectly satisfactory living arrangements because the owner of the building wants to turn it into a short-term accommodation. And
Sorry, so these two here are the two that are currently in there. Sort
Where's
of
the
the
third
giant page 3. When we looked at it, we were looking at, and this is my fault, the previous version of this document. But when council approved the action plan last year, we actually went down to just those two.
I see. Okay,
Yeah.
so the tiny home option was dropped.
It's actually in that second one there.
Investigate
So
viability.
yeah,
Oh,
get rid
it
of
is?
that
Oh.
page 3 somehow.
So I think that we need to and what do we realistically think Mahone Bay, the tiny town, physically and numerically, what can we achieve realistically around housing? And what are the implications for surrounding municipality? Should we really be thinking about housing as a collaborative issue with the other municipality, especially with Modal? Is there any mileage in that? And if so, how would you approach that? It's one of the approaches that actually has been encouraged by some of the literature to investigate how to work intermunicipally. I have no idea how that would work, but it's worth thinking about. So the basic question is, what, as a very small town, a very small place, and numerically very small, what do we really want to achieve, and how much do we want to control? So, I mean, I'm thinking that taking the kind of steps that the CAO has referred to in managing our residential zones effectively, which facilitate the opportunities for secondary suites or secondary buildings. I mean, I personally sometimes look at my lot, which is quite large, and wonder if I could subdivide and put a little a smaller unit at the back of my lot and rent out or sell the front half. I don't know, but as a person with a dwindling income, I've wondered about that. So personally and theoretically, I think that's a really good approach. Is to look at those what you can facilitate and what you can limit, and I really would like to look at limiting short-term accommodations. I think it's a very serious problem.
Do you think that second unit that you just suggested on your property might be appropriate? Do you see an issue in public engagement to find out how your neighbors would feel about another small house being built on your lot?
Yeah, I don't know what the procedure would be. I mean,
No, but
yeah.
Yeah, do you see that as having any, is the notion of public consultation an issue when we went through the bylaw process anyway?
Yeah, it would
Yeah.
have to. It would have to go through, have the public engagement if the bylaw was to be changed. That's part of the
Okay.
process.
Councillor O'Neill?
On that point, I think some of us have seen a rather brilliant initiative by HRM to look at their housing stock and to specifically ask their residents the question about secondary in-house suites and secondary buildings.
Do they differentiate
They
between the two
do,
in
they
the
do,
survey?
and in the survey, it's really very well done, and it's online, and they show graphic examples of as well, like blueprint schematics of what exactly they're talking about, and so they actually have done some thinking around size limiting to, for example, 2 bedrooms, or what it looks like as an
For the second
indwelling
building.
suite. Yes, yeah.
We already do have some permissions around secondary suites. They have to be attached, I believe. Is that
Yeah,
right?
there are some provisions, and I
Yeah.
think if I can say what this really comes down to, and especially the mayor's great point about the public engagement side of this, is we're coming into a plan review. If council, I think, quite clearly sees the majority of our tools to influence housing as being regulatory through the planning strategy and land use bylaw, then there's an opportunity as a priority area of that review to say housing with the objective, to Councillor O'Neill's point, with the objective that council would define for that review being to actually look at how do we encourage more smaller, more flexible development for seniors to continue to stay in their homes in the community or choose to live here.
But in the process of doing that, and I'd go back to one of your very first comments, we have to have some kind of a vision of what we see the town looking like. I mean, I have people now that are in a general way will say to me, don't change anything. Like it just the way it is. Don't want to have this, don't want to have that. Is that real? I'm not sure if it is in 2020, but that seems to be a lot of the consensus around town. But we have to, I think our role is to generate for the citizens what some alternatives might be for them to consider. Will it work for every part of the town? I don't think it will. It will certainly for those places with folks that have got large building lots. But it's like the greenhouse on Pleasant Street. How many people complained about the amount of the lot that was taken up by that greenhouse?
And lot coverage, which we've talked about, like maybe there need to be increases, but there need to be decreases to support some of the infill stuff. So
And it goes to what do you want your town to look like? Right? John said to me a couple of days ago, I'm not going to be here in 40 years to see what it's like, so but you still need to have that forward vision whether you're going to be here or not. Right?
But it's interesting, we talked about this, the economics on subdividing land and or the small houses, I think, as Councillor Bay mentioned, the economics just are not there for our town for all the obvious reasons. One, we have the cost of subdividing and paying the town's green tax or the space, open space tax. I'm not sure what that bylaw is called, actually the official bylaw is called. But that's a real payment, you know, so that's.
Sorry, what is that you're referring to?
So if you subdivide your lot,
Oh.
like say the one on Main Street, like the cost of the one-time tax to the town to replace the green space was, you know, not quite 5,000, but like a real number, like a material number when you talk about surveying, legal fees, and the Mahone Bay special subdivision tax.
Mr. White was quite thrilled.
Right.
What conversations you had with him?
but
The property owners bears that.
the property owner pays that. But the point is, like, when you do the math on, you know, we're talking about affordable housing and a small house, like the idea is, oh, I have a small house, I have a small cost.
But would
No.
they have to subdivide their property, or could you not put a property like a second dwelling?
Well, if you could get
depends on our
financing,
rules.
right? You need
Right.
financing, someone needs to, what do you know.
You're not going to do it for $5,000.
No, exactly right. But that's my question, and I was wondering if there are, you know, as more, you know, government level or provincial government level. Let me reframe that. I wonder if there's provincial or other funding sources available for people who are interested in building housing, for example, for seniors. Because I know through the gentleman who came here to talk about creating affordable housing in your own home, said that there were funding sources available. I mean, it's not free money, but it's low interest loans and things like that. So I wonder if part of our role could be connecting people who would be interested in doing that with that information.
That's a good point. One of the suggestions in the idea bank that was appended to,
Yep, saw it.
yeah, okay, was more or less along that line, which was one of the things that municipalities can do. Is to provide as much information as possible about opportunities. What grants are available, I mean, whether it ranges from the kind of grants that are available for upgrading of homes for low-income seniors, which there are many, whether ranging all the way to grants that are available to developers, and that kind of facilitating kind of information, so that's something that municipalities can do, and that idea is specified in the idea bank.
I had a discussion yesterday about co-op housing. You know, you can't force people to do it, but there are situations in this town where large homes are occupied by one person, and people are looking for alternatives. Maybe one of the things that we could do is have the discussion with a couple of lawyers to find out what the legal issues would be for 2 or 3 or 4 people to co-op house together. What about Bank of Montreal or banks that might finance an opportunity? What happens to I'm picking 4 people who go into the co-op if one of them dies? What happens to the piece that they bought? I mean, how they organize their lifestyle is up to them. But what we would have for them is just information. Some of the basic questions and where they would go for more information to make co-op housing in the same house, a group of adults, as an opportunity. And then if they vacate smaller homes, which then come on the market at market prices for young families to move into. I don't know.
Is there any opportunity to use differentiated tax rates for houses that are being lived in versus houses that have absentee owners? I think PEI had something along those lines.
Vancouver does as well.
They do started in the 70s.
Yeah, I mean, Nova Scotia does allow municipalities to have seasonal reductions in taxes, but if you're talking about like penalizing it,
Yeah, that's what I'm talking
yeah,
about.
I don't think anyone's ever looked at it that way under the MBA. I doubt that we're allowed to do it, but I can look at the MBA.
You have a very
And
prominent
a house on Main Street, say a couple hundred yards up the street that hasn't been lived in 30 odd years, that sits there year after year after year, still looks very stately, but there hasn't been a living soul other than a church mouse that's lived in a house in 35 years now in a row. It's been emptied and boarded up. Then I'm just wondering, at what point is there anything you can do legislatively to provide an incentive to the owner to say, fill it up, use it, somehow, sell it or keep it, but pay more, or anyway, I'm out of my depth here when I'm saying that. This is just me spitballing.
The house will never be sold.
I
It'll stay in the
Which
family.
house is that, Carl?
Next to my daughter's.
Yeah. Dean Cocker.
I think you talked with
Yes.
Cocker too.
Yeah, the company.
Yeah.
But
But that's just an example.
We're struggling
right? There's
now
a number of
trying
ways.
to get rid of the cap.
Yeah.
And the cap shifts the responsibility for the tax bill to every other citizen in town away from the person. If we start looking at tax reductions for those kinds of scenarios, we're just shifting it to another group of people and their tax rate effectively increases.
I was thinking
as a
tax.
result.
So fair. I take that point. I was thinking about, and I thought this was really in the context of, say, a Vancouver scenario where you actually, or you have that in, say, a lot of little New England towns as well, where if you're a seasonal resident, you pay higher tax rate than if you're a year-round resident.
Yeah.
That's what I was kind of getting to.
Arguably, they're not contributing to the economic or lifeblood of the town
Yeah.
for 6 months of the year, only the 6 months that they
Well,
live
the
there.
Vancouver situation in particular is interesting because they have foreign investors who are buying these homes,
Yeah.
leaving them empty,
Yeah.
and they have my understanding is, as of a couple of years ago, like these homeowners can be fined up to $10,000 a day in some cases in Vancouver for leaving these homes empty. Like they're taking it very seriously because it's really it's caving in, the city's ability to function properly.
Some of those landowners can say, here's a year's
Yes,
worth,
right,
call me when
exactly.
that money's
Yeah.
gone.
Well, to your point, like I was talking to Nick, the proprietor of the grocery store, and he was just desperate in January because so many people snowbird
Mhm.
and they leave now, and his volume goes off materially, which is why we're paying like $2 for a pound of bananas right now, when the rest of the year it's 69 cents. So there are very real financial impacts on year-round citizens when you have a town that's so substantially impacted by seasonality, tourism, and just vacation trends.
Yeah, I agree. It's something I've wondered about for a long time too, is a differential tax rate for empty houses. So I'd appreciate more information about.
Penalized.
Yeah.
I'd also like to go back to a point that the mayor was talking about, the idea of co-op housing. I think we have to just get our terminology straight. Co-op housing is a particular kind of arrangement where people intentionally
Decide to.
Yeah, so, and it's not the same as co-housing, and it's not the same as co-living. So, co-living literally is 2 or 3 or 4 people who enter into a shared housing arrangement informally and can come and go.
It's not a legal entity.
Not necessarily. They
No.
could be renting an apartment or renting a building.
Like roommates, classically.
Yeah, essentially, yeah. Whereas co-op housing is a whole different structure. That's a more legal structure, and co-housing is a kind of project that is going on in Bridgewater right now, where they have their property. They will be building co-housing, which involves 20 or 30 different parties. They are trying to get various ages to buy into homes that are separate homes but with some shared facilities, and it's a very intentional community. Co-op housing tends to be less intentional in terms of the whole ethos. If you go into the top floor, there was a lot of co-op housing for a period of time in the 60s, 70s, 80s. It stopped being funded for a long period of time, and it's coming back. It's coming back now.
Yeah.
There's some co-op housing being developed in the Yarmouth County, and it could be possible to learn more from them about what they're developing and to see if there's something that could be done here. It comes back to a question of are we looking at Mahone Bay entity specifically, or are we looking at the larger area geographically? Just as a bit of information, the idea of co-living, which is sort of sharing your house in an informal way, although there would have to be some kind of formalities around agreements and understandings. The shack has received a grant from the Department of Seniors to do a traveling roadshow around Lunenburg County to talk about sharing your big house. And so the grant is to prepare information, prepare some visuals, to go out around the community to 20 or 25 different areas and to simply talk about the idea, to start planting the seeds for people, because it's a big change for people to think about sharing their home. It's just a start.
Can we host a housing seminar at the Mahone Bay Center?
We'll do it here, yeah.
And let people see what the different options are?
Yeah, so but the conversation would be mainly around co-living, so that it could be a senior could share a house with another senior, somebody they know. It could be somebody they don't know already. It could be a single parent sharing a home. So it depends on what people what space they have, how they could imagine it. They could then be also eligible if their income eligibility is the right, would be eligible for some renovations and grants for renovations. So there's all sorts of possibilities.
Is the property that's on the corner of Spruce Street and Pleasant Street that has the outdoor furnace that's filled?
Right opposite my house. you mean?
Yes, that apartment building, which has been in place as long as I've been here, and far before that, 50 years anyway, right? Danatorn building, yeah.
It was built intended for seniors, I believe.
But which I think has what 6, 7, 8 units or whatever. But that the lot that the furnace is on, and lack of a better word, is that its own building lot? Do you think?
That's the whole lot. That's the whole.
That's an
One
entire building lot.
Yeah,
It's just got the fireplace, just got the you know,
and the logs.
the furnace
Don't forget
and the
the
logs.
logs.
Anyway.
The whole woodlot operation.
Yeah.
Chainsaws going all day yesterday,
Charming
the day
looking
before.
site.
You're so lucky.
Mhm.
So I don't want to interrupt.
Sorry, I was just curious about that.
Yeah.
You know.
Well, that's and it has been
Rentals in
certainly
that building.
lower level rental for a long time. Yeah.
Yeah, rentals in that building, I think, are now up to 700 and something, 725, I think, for two bedroom apartments.
I buy the trading company. There's I don't know how many units upstairs
Yeah.
there, but there's quite a few there. So.
Yeah, well, I don't know what the owner is thinking for that. So having heard a good amount of discussion, I just, if people don't mind, thought I would kind of summarize where I heard the discussion going. It sounds like there's a lot of interest in what we can do via regulation in the land use bylaw and even associated bylaws like subdivision bylaw, opportunities to consider how developers will respond to our regulations, what we have in place. I heard some great suggestion around making that information more proactively available. We're doing a website redesign. It's a great opportunity to address the current lack of information for developers on our website. It really doesn't, even in order to find the municipal planning strategy and land use bylaw, you have to go to 2 different parts of the website currently, and there's certainly no helpful resources for developers section.
Can I ask you, when you were using the word developer, are you talking about like general contractors, or are you talking about individual homeowners as well as developers?
The way I'm using it is just to indicate that anyone who's going to make an investment in housing stock, whether that's in their own, adding an additional unit, whether that's building a separate development, so broad brush developer.
Okay.
So resources for property owners, developers. Looking at, through our plan review, the regulations, we have an opportunity to really look at if we are actually doing as much as we can do, or creating some perhaps incentives that run in the wrong direction around encouraging the behavior that we're after. And to the mayor's point, that process is going to have a lot of public involvement. We will have, I expect, surveys similar to what the HRM has online, and we'll also have sessions on specific subjects. Once we've hired a contractor, we'll have a session specific to housing, I would expect. And that contractor will start by meeting with council to go over priority areas, that kind of thing. So before we craft what that session would look like, we'll have time to have talked about it. What I didn't hear a lot of, we had some good discussion of, was really a way forward that anyone is seeing around making specific land available for development with I'll check with Housing Corp, but if we're not looking at that provision of direct affordable housing, but we're looking at influencing development and the context and the market and making resources available. So for me, that's a great direction, because I think when we look at our strategic plan, we have an opportunity to say that what we're really trying to do, and we should talk about the values that drive it, but what we're really trying to do is use our regulatory power in order to encourage certain outcomes within development within the community.
Or to ensure that our regulatory power doesn't interfere with people trying to pursue a housing goal.
And then secondarily, we want to make resources and connections to help support development and support people to be able to make these access federal sources and other things. But what I'm not hearing is much around direct provision. We explored a couple different avenues, but it seems like that might not be something that staff would be asked. Currently, I don't feel that we are. Not seeing a lot of appetite for it. So when you get to the strategic plan review, based on the discussion that we've had here, I would expect that we'll try to take the opportunity to clarify what we're trying to do with our regulatory regime and our bylaws and our incent, what we have there, but not at the current time. I'm not hearing anything where I need to go and look at a particular technique or option around provision of affordable units directly, but I just want to make sure that I've said that that's how I've heard this conversation.
But in order for us to do that review that you're talking about, part of that process, beyond engaging with the public, is developing that view or that vision of what the people in our town see our town becoming over the next 30 to 50 years. And then that's the stepping off point where we ensure that we've given them the right ground rules to make that happen.
Just specifically to that point, Dylan, I just think given our overall program, which includes new senior complex, new fire hall, and then we have a number of other strategic investments along the waterfront and as well as wastewater, we're just not in a position to have a realistic conversation today about expansion of our service footprint. And we might, so inevitably the day will come when a future council will debate the merits of expanding the service footprint for water and sewer and power and lights so that we could potentially do a large subdivision, whether it be on the historical soccer field theoretically or some other location.
Yeah, go ahead.
So at some time, every dog has its day, and maybe at some time that'll be a conversation that council will have to have, but we're just not in a position to have a realistic conversation about that because we have a big agenda before we would get to that. But the day may come.
But if we have a housing plan,
Right.
and there's a specific federal provincial funding program to address housing,
Right,
and doesn't impact our foreshore situation,
right.
then we could, but we
Take
have to have
advantage
that housing plan, kind of a notion of what it's gonna be.
But is that sort of the general feeling around the table that, expansion of the service footprint, putting in sewer and water and light and power and lights and infrastructure to a new geographic region of Mahone Bay, to Dylan's point, like that, we're just not in a position to do that in the very short term. It doesn't
Well, and I
seem
should
to me.
clarify, when I was saying, I mean the act of putting up land, partnering with a developer and creating housing.
Yeah.
The idea that we could be able to put in new infrastructure, I think that's maybe a separate point.
Okay.
I do think that council, if the town were talking about paying 100% to do something like that on our own, that would be something we'd approach through capital planning. We'd have to have a specific property in mind. But I would certainly encourage, as part of the land use bylaw, subdivision bylaw piece, for the council to explore a local improvement bylaw, which actually sets conditions on which a developer will pay for and be required to pay for, to the discussion we had about Hawthorne Hill. We don't have a local improvement bylaw, so we really haven't set the tone in terms of, is there a threshold at which a developer, because we have another bylaw saying whether they're required to or not, right? And they can come to council and they can, but let's say that they didn't come to council and they were going to do it all themselves. How is that being allocated out to the properties? So when a subdivision is being developed in HRM, they're basically just managing those costs from the municipality to the eventual homeowner, right? The developer being caught in the middle of that, there are some things, the way the HRM does it, that make it more streamlined or more straightforward to that eventual homeowner taking on those costs rather than the developer being on the hook in perpetuity for them. So I do think there's some things that we could do to be able to facilitate opening up and extending our service footprint without necessarily, there's no expectation, we're in fact prohibited from existing ratepayers paying those costs, but in a way that the future purchasers and developers of those lots, like on Hawthorne Hill, wouldn't everybody have rather had the $10,000 of debt and at least have the municipal system, if we're talking about the holes in the backyard?
Definitely.
And that would have been something we could have facilitated with a bylaw, the way the HRM does.
Okay. Councillor Carver, you had a comment?
I do now. It's just Dylan answered that question, but I have another question. It's about could we find out more about the Renouf property, the status of it, and
How
What's
big is
that?
it?
I'm gonna say around 8 acres, but it's not all in
Half.
Bay.
yeah,
Yeah.
and
But like I say, he died, and I don't know where the estate stands now.
Yeah, staff ability to find out more about that is
Yeah.
sometimes pretty limited.
yeah.
I mean, we can only look at the titles and, you know,
Yeah,
What's
he
on
lives in
the-
Halifax.
the behind the scenes you're gonna get probably more, you guys may know the people to talk to, but.
I just remembered the other things I was talking about. There is money in the CMHC, all the new housing stuff. CMHC does have money for developing a plan. I mean, if we were serious about developing a plan, so there is money for that, for planning. The provincial plan also, the provincial action plan from 2019 to 2022. I'd have to look it up again to find out. I mean, there may be some supportive some opportunities there if we are thinking about doing anything more concrete.
Yeah.
And I think that's the discussion when we get the strategic plan review is, can we adequately capture by amending, encourage a range of housing options? Can we capture council's values and a couple of actions? One of those actions, if necessary, can be, as it has been in a number of other areas, to develop a standalone plan. But that's the discussion we can have at the strategic plan, is whether that's necessary and whether staff would be tasked to do that, and over what time.
I'm also.
Oh, sorry, Penny, I didn't mean to cut you
Councillor
off.
Bain had his hand
Yeah,
up
yeah.
there, Penny, and
I
then
did not.
Councillor O'Neill.
I
Back to you.
I agree looking at the strategic plan to accommodate some of the discussions we've had regarding houses and the housing situation in Mahone Bay and what do we need and what will we encourage. But I think just pointing out something that has happened in Mahone Bay over the past number of years, it's been developers coming in and doing it on their nickel.
Yeah.
We have a DA, development agreement. We've had a lot happen in the last number of years with across the street at the Quinlan, developments on Kinburn,
Bob Uden's properties.
behind the town hall here, and that was all done with private initiative. Coming in, saying this is what I can see can happen in this town. We had the ability to approve it. The Quinlan was a little while getting off the ground, and we went through a lot of
Grief.
grief getting that one done.
There's-
Anyway,
There's no town nickel in the nursing home either.
no,
It's all private
the
sector.
the nursing home is going to be very interesting because it's going to be the domino effect as to what will happen with the old nursing home, what may impact our pharmacy, our
Yep.
opportunity, the medical
the
center to
vacancies
become a
in-
daycare center, and I mean, this is done with
Try to
private
get
dollars.
it in.
And
Yeah.
yet it generates big dollars for the town if you don't consider the social aspects, if you just look at the financial aspects of utilities. And as one of our developer says, yes, I bought that great big lot, I infilled it, I could have built one house on it. And you'd have got $4,500 a year, because it's gonna be a big house. However, I built 30 units on it, so do the math.
Yeah.
And that was not because we suggested he do it. He looked at it as a way of making some money. The condo up the way that was on the old McLean property, that was done completely by initiative. He says he will not do anything again in Mahone Bay because of the restrictions and not being able to use his lower units as rents.
Yeah.
And I don't know, I think I know what he was talking about, but I did not out and out ask him.
Councillor O'Neill?
Just wanted to respond to something the CAO said around what would and wouldn't be in the sort of a list of things to look into. The technical aspect that I would very much appreciate that directly addresses affordable housing and use of land in the town for, you know, whatever purpose for the next council that comes in and has to discuss it, is the something that's been mentioned in council before but not fully explored, which is the community land trust as a counterpoint to, for example, donating land for a purpose. So I would just like, I think it would be worth exploring as a paradigm that could possibly be used.
So that's certainly one of those examples where, like, at this point, I wouldn't do work on that, and a lot of the work is legal costs that we'd probably incur, unless either council passes a motion directing staff to specifically look into that and come back, or during the strategic plan review that ends up being specifically referenced there. Just because land trusts are a very specific instrument, and there would be a lot of work entailed to the town leading something like that.
Okay, thanks for clarifying.
Yeah.
And you mentioned about tiny homes, and one of the
Small
questions,
homes, yeah.
or small homes, but one of the questions that I would wonder would be, how does the building code impact small homes?
Flies.
What about the foundation? What about the water and the sewer? And because in some cases, the tiny homes, you see them and they got the wheels on them, for God's sake. They tow them around with a truck. Clearly, they're not going to be acceptable. But what happens, when you have someone that wants to build a smaller home and feels that a composting toilet is adequate? That perhaps all the facets of the building code may not be deemed to apply because I don't know. That's why I would ask.
Building code is the building code. It
Okay.
doesn't matter if it's 800 square feet or 2,800 square
So
feet.
if you're going to put a second property in your backyard, it's going to be plumbed. It's going to be sewer run into the system.
So what if you had a Winnebago or a traditional, like a big camper van? You just plugged it into power and
Don't we
started
have a
renting them
bylaw
out?
that prevents living in a?
Yeah.
I think
Oh, yeah,
for
okay.
an
Didn't
extended
know that.
period.
I didn't know
The
that.
bylaw on mobile homes, I'm told, is gone.
Yeah,
It,
that went out the last review.
it was repealed.
Yep.
Something we might want to revisit, unless you want to have a town full of
Well,
Tin
I
dominions.
imagine it was, I'm not speaking, Carl, you were here, but probably rolled into the land use bylaw, whatever
Yeah.
regulations were,
Yeah.
were necessary.
Is there a bylaw right now that prohibits putting a second unit on your property?
Yes.
I know on
Because if you
Pine
know,
Grove, we had to
if you remember,
give
your
special
neighbor
approval.
there had to apply for
Apply for
development
special
review.
approval.
yeah.
And that was just for her.
It's the lot coverage thing they get you
Yeah.
on too.
Not to belabor the meeting, Mayor, but there was a story in the media in the last week and a half about Porter's Lake and the fact
Floating
that
homes.
yes, floating home development, and we don't need to get into it so much in this particular meeting, but I was struck by the idea that sometimes the ingenuity of the developers, as we've experienced in the town in the last little bit. I mean, if there's a profit there, someone will figure out a way to extract it.
Mhm.
So you start thinking about, now I just have a floating wharf with 10 or 15 individual units bobbing up and down, but anchored to a wharf. They're not really houseboats because they're attached to a wharf, but you can rent them out as well.
But they're not in the town because they're sitting on provincial water.
Right, no
Right.
property tax.
Anyway, I was struck by the ingenuity of it. But
I just wonder what's going to keep them from crushing the Rana Lake.
Interestingly
Make the
enough,
shoreline
when our
the
MP
ocean.
gets here, she is going to share with us that the federal government controls the waterfront on the west coast, and they can limit fish farms, but not on the Atlantic coast. The province runs the show here. So what the Prime Minister has directed Bernadette Jordan to do as the fisheries minister to clean up the fish farm issue on the west coast doesn't apply to the Atlantic coast.
Holy moly.
So and I'm sure we'll hear that when she comes to visit us, because that's on the agenda.
We-
Anyway,
We
I-
basically heard that when we met with the provincial government up there
yeah,
the last 10 years ago.
I have to have it before.
yes, please.
Just to pursue the idea of somehow what kind of collaboration might be possible across municipalities with modal. I'm just interested to know whether that is a possibility.
You mean like for the Renouf lands, is that what you're,
Well, that could be an
where
example,
they,
actually.
partly it's their land?
No, just the general concept, because housing. I mean, we often get stuck in thinking about Mahone Bay as a silo. But we all know that there's permeable boundaries. People from Modal come and go. People who live in Modal work in Mahone Bay. People who live in Mahone Bay work in
Most
other
of the
places.
people who work in Mahone Bay don't live in the town.
But one of the suggestions was, in the idea bank, was to look at municipal collaboration around housing. I have no idea what it would look like, how it would work, but I'm just putting that idea out for the people who
Is
do
Shack
things
a
into
vehicle
municipal.
for that?
I was just gonna wonder, would you
Yeah,
discuss
we
that at
could.
Shack
We could.
first?
We could, yeah,
Yeah.
we could do that.
Agenda item.
Yeah, I guess the
Yeah.
difference would be like more of the development of a strategy. Like Jack is a way that the units definitely explore across boundaries. So I would say again, the strategic plan. If there's a thought to developing a strategy, and there's a thought maybe that the strategy should be at the county level, then I think that could be something that we do put in a strategic plan.
Okay, and the people who, at the, other venues, just keep it in mind. Just keep it in mind. When you're
Other venues?
Joint services or mayors, county,
Mayors, deputies,
and
CAOs?
CAOs meetings.
The notion of the joint strategy on housing, you mean?
Yeah, I'm just planting a seed, keep it in mind. That's all.
Okay,
She's coming.
anything else?
If everybody's good, I think that was pretty productive. And
That's the ball game, your worship.
what's then on our agenda?
It's the runs in the way.
When you do call this to order, but before everyone leaves the room, I have a quick question on Friday. if I can ask.
Okay.
Close to adjourn, your worship.
Motion to adjourn. Before we do adjourn, I would ask if council, just council, could take a few moments. I have to leave at 11:30 with Mr. Hyde. We're going up to Halifax for a meeting with the provincial government, so this is not going to go on very long, but I'd like to have a discussion with council in camera if I could,
Sure.
when this meeting is, well, we won't conclude the meeting until after the in-camera session.
Can we do
That's
that
okay.
without
It's
announcement?
it's a personnel issue.
Can we do it without formally advising the public that we're holding an in-camera meeting?
Well, they're all here.
Folks,
Formal notice. Formal
well, we
notice.
told
What is
them that, we told them that there was gonna be an
Any
in-camera
camera
session.
session,
Yeah.
okay.
Around contract negotiations, not around personnel issues.
Well, they can't sit here anyway.
I'm asking what the formal requirement for public notice is around holding a meeting in camera.
The failure to provide to provide notice does not invalidate the meeting, especially if we're already here.
So ideally, at the beginning of this meeting, under approval of the agenda, we would have added personnel to the reasons for going in camera, but that doesn't stop council if the majority is willing to go in camera for another reason at this meeting.
And the reason why I didn't add it at the front end is I wasn't sure how long this meeting was gonna go. And I did not wanna try and have an in-camera meeting at 11:25 when we had to leave for Halifax.
Thank you for clarifying the guidelines.
For the timing's sake. Okay,
So I'm
Are
gonna
we gonna
assume
close the
personnel
doors?
is me,
Yo.
because you're asking me not to be here.
yeah,
So then, I don't know, can we just take a 1-minute break for me to ask my question, because I'm not gonna
no,
be here?
go ahead.
Okay, my question is just on Friday, we have an invitation from Bernadette responding to our having reached out. She'd be looking for one anyway, there was a federal election. To meet at 9 o'clock, many of you have said that you would be available. What I do not know is, should I be posting a agenda for that meeting, because we're all getting together for a meeting. Last year, we did not do that. We do have the opportunity to go through our normal required practice of posting a meeting with a single item, which would be to hear from Bernadette. Today is the deadline to do that for Friday. Otherwise, as we did last year, we can accommodate the meeting. I'm always uncomfortable with that from a procedural point of view. It has always been done, and it is done by the other units. So I'm not saying you can't do it.
What's done by the other units?
Meeting with our MPs and MLAs without declaring an actual meeting.
If it comes to a vote, my preference would be to give the information to the public that a meeting, that the MP is meeting with council on Friday.
How does the MP feel about it?
Well, she has previously said she'll meet with us either way, but she'll speak perhaps differently or less candidly in a meeting that is open. But she's quite willing to do either. She's always said that. It's just we have to decide.
I mean, I don't believe that the meeting with the MP needs to be public per se. If there's information that the town requires that can only be extracted through a in-camera conversation with the minister. I don't think the expectation from the minister that every comment she makes is in the public domain is necessarily an issue. I think that would be a reasonable expectation for the minister to expect that she could speak candidly.
On the record?
This isn't a public meeting. If she wanted to speak to the public, I mean, she can avail herself of that opportunity at any time.
My
Councillor
understanding
Kerwin?
about meetings is that we either have public meetings or we have in-camera meetings, and I do not believe that meeting with the federal minister is one of the reasons for having an in-camera meeting.
It depends on what the
Yeah,
topic
no,
is.
I mean, in this case, we don't have grounds to go in camera.
Depending on what the depending on
Well,
what
so
the
far,
topic
the
is.
only topics that I'm understanding she's coming here to talk to us about are our invitation that they talk to us about shoreline funding, and then the one topic that's been raised of open offshore aquaculture. With those two topics, neither of those provide us grounds to go in closed session. So I agree, Penny. The way I phrased it was meant to indicate we're either having a meeting, which is by its nature open, which means that a media person could be here,
So
or we're not having a meeting, but the MLA is being entertained here by the council, which is what's happened in the past.
So the conversation on the aquaculture investment is not in camera, but the request from the aquaculture company to meet with council is in camera?
No.
Does that make any sense?
No, it's
No,
open
they're
meeting.
not in camera.
We're not meeting with them.
Come and open.
That's an open meeting.
We're meeting with them in the open.
Fair enough, but that,
Put a flyer up, you'll see the gallery full of, that's you call all your friends.
I mean, you might get the media here is the only thing.
Councillor Carver and with the CAO that the Municipal Government Act does not provide. If the MP was coming to talk to us about some piece of federal legislation that would impact on the contract or the
Yeah.
CERMAC, that'd be different.
fair enough.
But she's not. She's just coming in for a. So I think we
Yeah.
put the notice out.
Sure.
And if somebody shows up, we give them $1, tell them to go home again. Right? But I think it has to be a public
Sure.
meeting, unless she says otherwise. And certainly if she's hedging on a conversation, you can always talk to her offline and get the full answer.
Stick up a notice in the post office.
Yeah.
Let's get on with it.
Okay,
Thanks very much.
are you okay with that?
Yes, yeah,
All right,
and
sir.
I'm sorry to have to interrupt the meeting, but you're all here,
All
so
right.
it's a good
Okay.
opportunity.
Can I just need to
Yep,
leave the room
okay.
before you back?
Eddie's going for a smoke break.
Six 6:30.
Motion to go in camera, moved by Councillor O'Neill, seconded by Councillor Bain.
Okay.
And you wanna
Second.
know the time that we come out?